The Labor members are up for that.
Tim McIndoe.
Mr Speaker, I thank Mr Sheppell for that indication, and I want to reiterate that the purpose of this bill is to extend the restrictions on the awarding of compensation for 1 year from the 1st of July. That's just 1st of July, that's just 2 days away. And this is very important to ensure that the victims' claims process continues to apply to any compensation awarded or to be paid pursuant to an out-of-court final settlement in respect of a prisoner's claim made on or after the 1st of July this year. So, Mr Speaker, it is a bill to bridge the gap between the expiry of the current regime and progressing the Prisoners and Victims Claims Redirecting Prisoner Compensation Bill, which is the 2011 bill, through the House. The 2011 bill provides for the existing victims' claims process to be made permanent and redirects any prisoner's compensation remaining after that process to fund services and programs for the victims of crime. So while I appreciate that most parties in this House are supporting this bill's passage through the House, and I do thank them for that, I'm also aware that some members opposite have been critical of the government's management of this measure in the previous debates on it, and during the committee stage in particular. So I'd like just to place a couple of facts on the record about their own management of the legislative process. Because, Mr Speaker, part of the reason for this particular measure is the fact that the Labor Party left behind a criminal justice system in disarray. It was lacking accountability and it certainly lacked a focus on victims. Labor promised a victims' compensation scheme in 1994, 1996, 2005 and at the beginning of 2008, but they never delivered it. So it's a bit rich to come into this House now and criticise the fact that we are having to pass this measure. Mr Speaker, this Prisoners and Victims Claims Bill must be enacted tomorrow. That's how important it is. The consequences of failing to do so would be significant and clearly contrary to the public interest. So I conclude simply by repeating the observations of the Minister of Justice that this is a very straightforward bill that maintains the status quo for a limited period. I remind the House that the government has introduced a bill to give effect to our policy of redirecting prisoners' compensation to support victims of crime, rather than paying it to prisoners, as the public overwhelmingly expects and demands, and to make that new regime permanent. Rather than rushing that measure, this interim bill will bridge the gap and ensure that the bill that has been introduced may be accorded proper consideration and a full select committee process. All members should welcome that, and I know interested members of the public who will want to have the opportunity to submit on that bill and to be engaged in the process will also appreciate that consideration. So I welcome the anticipated passage of this bill this afternoon and its enactment tomorrow, and I look forward to working on the measure that will replace it on a more permanent basis during the months ahead.
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, can I begin by correcting the member who's just resumed his speech, Tim McIndoe, who hasn't been in the House very long, so I guess he can be forgiven for not knowing. Far from leaving the justice system in disarray, the two biggest pieces of legislation, the Sentencing Act and the Parole Act, were both passed in 2002. Shortly after that, there was a Victims Act, also passed by the Labor government. That replaced a previous Victims of Offences Act, also passed by a Labor government in the previous term, Mr Speaker. So I reject entirely the facile arguments raised by Tim McIndoe that the system was in disarray. In fact, the pieces of legislation that are most important in the justice system today were passed under the last Labor government, not the pieces of legislation that have gone through in the first 3 years of the National Government that are basically window dressing that do absolutely nothing. And secondly, Mr Speaker, the member had the effrontery to tell the House that this legislation is so important it must be passed by tomorrow. You know why it has to be passed by tomorrow, Mr Speaker? Because with 3.5 years' notice, the government did nothing, knowing full well that the existing legislation expires tomorrow. That is political mismanagement. This government should have acted in a timely way to get the new legislation into the House. And the fact that we are doing it now, the day before the recess, is an indication not of filibustering at all. It's an indication of incompetency in management.